night air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The forest alive with the whisper of leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. The moon cast an ethereal glow through the canopy, casting long, eerie shadows on the ground below. Kenta and Satoshi, two lifelong friends, had decided to escape the hustle and bustle of Tokyo by embarking on a weekend camping trip deep within the ancient woods of Akagahara. Their backpacks were heavy with supplies and their hearts light with the thrill of adventure. As they trekked deeper into the forest, the path grew narrower, the trees denser, their gnarled branches intertwining like the fingers of ancient spirits. Despite the beauty of their surroundings, a sense of unease began to settle in. The deeper they went, the quieter the forest became, as if it were holding its breath in anticipation. By the time they reached their campsite, the sun had dipped below the horizon, the sky a deep indigo sprinkled with stars. They set up their tent in a small clearing, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to watch them with unseen eyes. The crackling fire provided a small circle of warmth and light, its flames dancing and casting flickering shadows on their faces. Over dinner, they laughed and reminisced about their childhood, the stories of their youth, blending with the sounds of the night. But as the night grew darker, the laughter faded, replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to press down on them from all sides. The forest around them was unnervingly quiet, the usual sounds of nocturnal creatures conspicuously absent. Kenta, ever the curious one, suggested they explore the surroundings a bit before turning in for the night. Satoshi, though hesitant, agreed, not wanting to appear cowardly. They grabbed their flashlights and ventured into the woods, the beams cutting through the inky darkness. The trees loomed large and menacing, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The only sounds were their footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. As they walked, Kenta couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder repeatedly, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. Satoshi, sensing his friend's unease, tried to lighten the mood with a joke, but his voice sounded hollow and strained in the oppressive silence. They came across a small, overgrown path that seemed to lead deeper into the heart of the forest. A strange compulsion drew them forward, despite the growing sense of dread that gnawed at their insides. The path twisted and turned, leading them to a small clearing bathed in moonlight. In the center stood an old, weathered shrine, its wood darkened and worn by time. Kenta approached the shrine, his flashlight revealing intricate carvings of unknown creatures and symbols that seemed to writhe and twist in the flickering light. A cold shiver ran down his spine as he reached out to touch the weathered wood. Suddenly, a low whisper echoed through the clearing, the words indistinct but filled with malice. Kenta jerked his hand back, his heart pounding in his chest. Satoshi too heard the whisper, his eyes wide with fear. They exchanged a glance, both knowing they should leave immediately. But as they turned to go, the whisper grew louder, more insistent, the words now clear. "You shouldn't have come here." Panic surged through them, and they stumbled back along the path, their flashlights bobbing wildly in the dark. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees leaning closer as if trying to trap them. They ran, branches scratching at their skin, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Finally, they burst back into their campsite, collapsing by the fire, their hearts racing. They didn't speak of what they had heard, the fear too raw, too immediate. Instead, they sat in silence, the fire crackling softly, the night pressing in around them. As they finally crawled into their tent, the whispers still echoed in their minds, a chilling reminder of the unseen eyes in the forest. Kenta lay awake, staring at the tent ceiling, his thoughts a whirlwind of fear and confusion. What had they stumbled upon? And why did it feel as if the forest itself was alive, watching, waiting? He glanced over at Satoshi, who was already asleep, his face pale and troubled even in slumber. Kenta knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. But as the whispering woods loomed outside their tent, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had awakened something ancient and malevolent, something that would not easily let them go. Thus began their night of unease, the whispering woods around them, concealing secrets that would soon unravel, dragging them deeper into a nightmare from which there might be no escape. The morning light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the forest floor. Kenta and Satoshi emerged from their tent, their faces etched with fatigue from a night of restless sleep. The events of the previous night hung heavily in the air, a palpable tension that neither of them could shake. They exchanged uneasy glances as they gathered their belongings, their movements hurried and nervous. Despite the bright morning sun, the forest seemed darker, the trees closing in around them as if trying to keep them within its grasp. The whispering they had heard still echoed in their minds, a chilling reminder of the malevolent presence that lurked in the shadows. Kenta suggested they explore the area around the shrine in daylight, hoping to find some rational explanation for the eerie events. Satoshi, though reluctant, agreed, knowing that leaving without answers would only deepen their unease. They set off down the narrow path, their footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves. The forest was eerily silent, as if holding its breath in anticipation of their arrival. As they approached the clearing, the shrine stood before them, its weathered wood and intricate carvings bathed in the soft morning light. Kenta approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of danger. The carvings on the shrine seemed even more intricate in the daylight, the creatures and symbols twisting and turning as if alive. He reached out to touch the wood, half expecting the whisper to return. But there was only silence. Satoshi joined him, his face pale and drawn. "What do you think it means?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kenta shook his head, his mind racing with possibilities. "I don't know," he replied, "but I think we should look around, see if there's anything else that might give us a clue." They began to search the clearing, their eyes scanning the ground for anything out of the ordinary. As they moved further from the shrine, Kenta noticed something half buried in the undergrowth. He bent down and brushed away the leaves, revealing an old, leather-bound book. The cover was worn and faded, the pages yellowed with age. He opened it carefully, his fingers trembling. The book was filled with handwritten notes and drawings detailing rituals and incantations. The language was archaic, the symbols unfamiliar, but there was an undeniable sense of power within its pages. Kenta's heart pounded in his chest as he read the words, seeming to pulse with a life of their own. Satoshi peered over his shoulder, his eyes wide with fear. "What is this?" he asked, his voice shaking. Kenta shook his head, unable to tear his eyes away from the book. "I don't know," he replied, "but it feels important, like it holds the answers to what's happening here." As they continued to read, a sense of dread settled over them. The book spoke of ancient spirits bound to the land by powerful rituals, and the price that must be paid to appease them. The drawings depicted gruesome scenes of sacrifice and torment, the faces of the victims twisted in agony. Kenta's stomach churned as he turned the pages, the images searing themselves into his mind. He felt a growing sense of unease, as if they were being watched. The whispering returned, low and insistent, the words indistinct, but filled with malice. He looked up, his eyes scanning the forest, but saw nothing. Satoshi grabbed his arm, his face pale with fear. "We need to leave," he said urgently. "This place, it's not safe." Kenta nodded, his mind racing. They hurried back to the campsite, their hearts pounding in their chests. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, the words now clear. "You cannot escape." Panic surged through them as they packed their belongings, their movements frantic. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees leaning closer as if trying to trap them. They ran, the whispering echoing in their ears, a constant reminder of the malevolent presence that pursued them. As they stumbled down the path, the whispering grew louder, more insistent, the words now clear and filled with menace. "You will never leave." Kenta's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced over his shoulder, the trees seeming to close in around them. The forest seemed alive, the shadows twisting and turning, the whispering growing louder with each step. Finally, they burst out of the forest, the sunlight blinding them. They collapsed on the ground, their hearts racing, the whispering fading into the background. They exchanged a glance, both knowing that they had narrowly escaped something ancient and malevolent. But the book they carried was a reminder that the forest's grip on them was far from over. As they made their way back to civilization, the whispering echoed in their minds, a chilling reminder of the unseen eyes that watched their every move. The sun set on the horizon, casting long shadows on the ground. Kenta and Satoshi knew that their ordeal was far from over. The book they carried held secrets that could unravel their very sanity. And the Whispering Woods would not easily let them go. As they walked, the whispering grew louder, a constant reminder of the malevolent presence that lurked in the shadows. They knew that the answers they sought lay within the pages of the book, but the price of those answers could be more than they were willing to pay. And as the darkness closed in around them, the Whispering Woods seemed to come alive, the shadows, twisting and turning, the ancient spirits watching, waiting for their next move. The train ride back to Tokyo was a silent one, punctuated only by the rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks. Kenta and Satoshi sat in their seats, the leather-bound book resting heavily on Kenta's lap. The events of the forest clung to them like a dark shadow, their minds racing with questions and fears. As the city skyline came into view, the normalcy of urban life felt both comforting and surreal. They disembarked at Shinjuku Station, the throngs of people and bright lights, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of the Whispering Woods. Yet, even amidst the bustling crowd, they couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Back at Kenta's apartment, they sat at the small kitchen table, the book between them. The air was thick with tension. The only sound the distant hum of traffic outside. Kenta opened the book to the first page, the yellowed paper crackling under his touch. They began to read, their eyes scanning the archaic script and detailed drawings. The book spoke of an ancient curse, a pact made by a village long ago to protect their land from invaders. In exchange for peace and prosperity, they had bound their spirits to the forest, becoming its eternal guardians. But over time, the pact had soared, the spirits growing restless and vengeful. Kenta's heart pounded as he read the words, seeming to pulse with a life of their own. The book detailed rituals to appease the spirits, dark and gruesome ceremonies that required great sacrifice. Satoshi looked up, his face pale. "This is insane," he said, his voice trembling. "We can't possibly believe this." Kenta nodded, but the unease in his gut told him otherwise. "We need to find out more," he said. "There has to be someone who knows about this." They spent the next few days researching, their lives consumed by the dark history of Aokigahara and the curse that bound the forest. They scoured libraries, old archives, and online forums, piecing together fragments of the story. The more they uncovered, the deeper their dread grew. The whispers they had heard in the forest were mentioned in several accounts, described as the voices of the bound spirits, warning intruders to leave. Each story ended in tragedy, the victims driven mad or disappearing without a trace. One evening, they found an old newspaper article about a reclusive historian who had dedicated his life to studying the supernatural phenomena of Aokigahara. His name was Professor Tanaka, and he lived in a remote village on the outskirts of the forest. Kenta and Satoshi knew they had to speak with him. The next morning, they set out for the village, the weight of the book heavy in Kenta's backpack. The journey was long and arduous, the winding mountain roads testing their resolve. By the time they reached the village, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the quaint houses and narrow streets. They found Professor Tanaka's house at the edge of the village, a small, weathered building surrounded by overgrown vegetation. Kenta knocked on the door, his heart pounding in his chest. An elderly man answered, his eyes sharp and piercing despite his age. They explained their situation, showing him the book and recounting their experiences in the forest. The professor listened intently, his expression grave. "This book," he said, his voice low and measured, is a record of the ancient pact made by the villagers of Aokigahara. It is both a guide and a warning. He led them into his study, a cluttered room filled with books and artifacts. He explained that the spirits bound to the forest were once human, their souls twisted by centuries of torment. The whispers they heard were the spirits' way of warning and protecting the forest from outsiders. But why now? Satoshi asked, his voice tinged with desperation. Why did they target us? Professor Tanaka shook his head. The spirits are restless, he said. The balance has been disturbed. Something or someone has angered them. Kenta and Satoshi exchanged a glance, the weight of the professor's words sinking in. What can we do? Kenta asked. How do we stop this? The professor sighed, his eyes filled with sorrow. There is a ritual, he said, a way to appease the spirits and restore the balance. But it requires a great sacrifice. He explained the ritual in detail, the steps intricate and the cost high. Kenta felt a cold knot of fear in his stomach. As he listened, the reality of their situation becoming painfully clear. They thanked the professor and left, the weight of their task pressing down on them. As they walked through the village, the whispers seemed to follow them, a constant reminder of the malevolent presence that awaited them in the forest. That night, back in their hotel room, they discussed their options. The ritual required them to return to the heart of the forest, to the shrine, where it had all begun. They would need to perform the ceremony exactly as described, using the items listed in the book. Failure to do so would result in dire consequences, both for them and for the spirits bound to the forest. Kenta and Satoshi knew they had no choice. The spirits would not rest until the balance was restored. The following morning, they gathered the necessary items, their resolve hardening with each passing moment. They set off for Aokigahara, the book and their supplies packed tightly in their bags. The forest loomed before them, dark and foreboding, the whispering growing louder as they approached. They followed the narrow path back to the shrine, the trees seeming to close in around them. The air was thick with tension, the forest alive with an unseen energy. As they reached the clearing, the shrine stood before them, its weathered wood and intricate carvings a stark reminder of the ancient pact. Kenta and Satoshi prepared for the ritual, their movements precise and deliberate. They placed the items around the shrine, following the instructions in the book to the letter. The air grew colder, the whispers more insistent, as if the spirits were watching their every move. Kenta began to chant the incantation, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped his heart. Satoshi joined in, their voices merging in a haunting melody that echoed through the clearing. The ground trembled beneath their feet, the air thick with a palpable energy. The shadows around them seemed to shift and dance, the whispering growing louder, more urgent. As they completed the ritual, a sudden silence fell over the forest. The air was still, the whispers gone, replaced by an eerie calm. Kenta and Satoshi exchanged a glance, their hearts pounding in their chests. Had they succeeded? Or had they only angered the spirits further? Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, its form shifting and indistinct. The figure spoke, its voice a low, menacing whisper. "You have disturbed the balance," it said. "The forest will not forgive." Kenta and Satoshi backed away, their hearts racing. The figure advanced, its eyes glowing with an unearthly light. "You must pay the price," it said, its voice echoing through the clearing. Kenta's mind raced, the fear gripping him like a vice. He looked at Satoshi, his eyes filled with determination. "We need to run," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Satoshi nodded, his face pale with fear. They turned and ran, the figure's voice echoing in their ears, the forest closing in around them. The path twisted and turned, the trees seeming to reach out and grab at them. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, the air thick with a malevolent energy. As they stumbled through the forest, the ground seemed to shift beneath their feet, the shadows twisting and turning. They ran, their hearts pounding, the fear driving them forward. Finally, they burst out of the forest, the sunlight blinding them. They collapsed on the ground, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The whispering faded, replaced by the distant hum of the city. They had escaped, but the price of their actions weighed heavily on them. The book lay between them, a reminder of the ancient pact and the spirits that would not easily let them go. As they made their way back to the city, the whispering echoed in their minds, a constant reminder of the unseen eyes that watched their every move. They knew that the balance had been disturbed, and the spirits of the forest would not rest until it was restored. The answers they sought lay within the pages of the book, but the price of those answers could be more than they were willing to pay. And as the darkness closed in around them, the whispering woods seemed to come alive, the shadows, twisting and turning, the ancient spirits watching, waiting for their next move. The city lights flickered outside the apartment window, a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness of the whispering woods. Kenta and Satoshi sat in silence, the weight of their recent ordeal pressing heavily on their shoulders. The ancient book lay open on the table, its pages filled with the dark history of the forest and the malevolent spirits that dwelled within. They had barely escaped with their lives, but the sense of unease had followed them back to Tokyo. The whispers, though faint, still echoed in their minds, a constant reminder of the unseen eyes that watched their every move. Kenta knew they couldn't run forever. The balance had been disturbed, and the spirits would not rest until it was restored. "We need to finish this," Kenta said, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped his heart. Satoshi nodded, his face pale and drawn. "But how?" he asked. Kenta flipped through the book, his eyes scanning the pages for any clue that might help them. The rituals described were complex and dangerous, requiring precise execution and great sacrifice. As he read, a plan began to form in his mind. "We need to return to the shrine," Kenta said, "and we need to perform the final ritual." Satoshi's eyes widened in fear. "Are you insane?" he asked. "We barely made it out alive last time." Kenta shook his head. "We don't have a choice," he said. "The spirits won't stop until the balance is restored, and we're the only ones who can do it." They spent the next few days preparing, gathering the necessary items and studying the ritual in detail. The air in the apartment was thick with tension, the whispers growing louder as the day of their departure approached. Finally, the morning of their journey arrived. They packed their bags and set off for Akigahara, their hearts heavy with the knowledge of what lay ahead. The forest loomed before them, dark and foreboding, the trees seeming to whisper secrets of the past. They followed the narrow path back to the shrine, their steps slow and deliberate. The air grew colder, the whispers more insistent, as if the spirits were watching their every move. As they reached the clearing, the shrine stood before them, its weathered wood and intricate carvings a stark reminder of the ancient pact. Kenta and Satoshi set up the items for the ritual, their movements precise and deliberate. The air was thick with tension, the forest alive with an unseen energy. Kenta began to chant the incantation, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped his heart. Satoshi joined in, their voices merging in a haunting melody that echoed through the clearing. The ground trembled beneath their feet, the air thick with a palpable energy. The shadows around them seemed to shift and dance, the whispering growing louder, more urgent. As they completed the ritual, a sudden silence fell over the forest. The air was still, the whispers gone, replaced by an eerie calm. Kenta and Satoshi exchanged a glance, their hearts pounding in their chests. Had they succeeded? Or had they only angered the spirits further? Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, its form shifting and indistinct. The figure spoke, its voice a low, menacing whisper. "You have disturbed the balance," it said. "The forest will not forgive." Kenta and Satoshi backed away, their hearts racing. The figure advanced, its eyes glowing with an unearthly light. "You must pay the price," it said, its voice echoing through the clearing. Kenta's mind raced, the fear gripping him like a vice. He looked at Satoshi, his eyes filled with determination. "We need to stand our ground," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Satoshi nodded, his face pale with fear. They faced the figure, their hearts pounding in their chests. Kenta stepped forward, his voice steady despite the terror that gripped him. "We seek to restore the balance," he said. "We mean no harm." The figure paused, its eyes narrowing. "You have brought great disruption," it said. "The spirits demand retribution." Kenta swallowed hard, his mind racing. "What must we do?" he asked. The figure raised a hand, its fingers curling like claws. "You must offer a sacrifice," it said. "One of you must remain with the forest." Kenta's heart pounded in his chest. He looked at Satoshi, his mind racing with fear and determination. "I will stay," he said, his voice steady despite the terror that gripped him. Satoshi's eyes widened in shock. "No," he said. "We can find another way." Kenta shook his head. "There is no other way," he said. "The spirits demand a sacrifice, and we have no choice." Satoshi's face crumpled in despair, but he nodded, tears streaming down his face. Kenta turned to the figure, his heart pounding in his chest. "I will stay," he said. "Let my friend go." The figure nodded, its eyes glowing with an unearthly light. "Your sacrifice will be honored," it said. "The balance will be restored." Kenta felt a cold chill wash over him as the figure advanced. He looked at Satoshi, his heart heavy with sorrow. "Go," he said. "Live your life." Satoshi nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I will never forget you," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. Kenta smiled, his heart etching with sorrow. "Nor are you," he said. The figure reached out, its hand cold and unyielding. Kenta felt a sudden rush of energy as the figure's hand closed around his. The world seemed to tilt and shift, the shadows closing in around him. He felt a sudden, intense pain as the figure drew him into the darkness. The last thing he saw was Satoshi's tear-streaked face, the forest fading into darkness. Satoshi stumbled out of the forest, his heart heavy with sorrow. The whispers were gone, replaced by an eerie silence. He made his way back to the city, his mind a whirlwind of grief and despair. The loss of his friend weighed heavily on him. The knowledge that Kenta had sacrificed himself to restore the balance, a constant ache in his heart. The book lay on the table, a reminder of the ancient pact and the spirits that dwelled within the forest. Satoshi knew he could never forget what had happened. The events of the past few weeks seared into his memory, but he also knew that Kenta's sacrifice had restored the balance. The spirits of the forest finally at peace. He looked out the window, the city lights flickering in the distance. The whispers were gone, replaced by an unearthly silence. And in that silence, he could almost hear Kenta's voice, a soft, reassuring whisper that everything would be all right. The whispering words were silent, the balance restored. The spirits that had once been bound to the forest were finally at peace, their ancient pact honored. And in the darkness, Kenta's spirit watched over his friend, a guardian of the forest and a reminder of the price that had been paid to restore the balance.